This series is based upon and inspired by the 2021 series Squid Game, created by Hwang Dong-hyuk and produced by Netflix. It also features art created by the fabulous Andrew MacLaine. November 1989. Never Can Say Goodbye by the Communards booms out over a nightclub's dance floor, which is filled with a smoky hue, flashing lights, and joyful cheers. Dancing to this song is a sea of young men. Some are shirtless, some have a drink in their hands, some are getting closer to each other, but they all appear to be having a good time. Within the middle of the dance floor, a young, skinny, yet attractive sandy-haired man named Alan is dancing with friends. He has clearly been drinking to excess and knocks into the man behind. This man glares back in annoyance, but Alan does not notice. As the chorus of the song plays on, he looks to the side and makes eye contact with a young red-headed man who gestures to his own nose and winks. Alan smiles and stumbles towards him. They dance intimately for almost a minute, and some of Alan's friends watch with amusement, whilst others show disapproval. The red-headed man lights a cigarette and shows a small bag in his pocket that contains a white powder. Alan grabs it by the belt, then looks into his eyes and nods to the toilets at the edge of the dance floor. When the instrumental bridge of the song begins, Alan takes the hand of the red-headed man and leads him through the dancing crowd. When they pass the final circle of dancers before the toilets, Alan takes a cigarette from the red-headed man and inhales, but trips into a shorter man and accidentally crushes the lit end into his neck. The shorter man shouts in pain, swings around, and smacks Alan's chest with his fist. Alan falls over, and other people watch in shock as he struggles to his feet and charges at the shorter man. However, a bouncer runs in and pulls Alan away, calling him a fucking mess and shouting that he saw what just happened. Alan tries to resist and staggers away, but the bouncer grabs him by the scruff of the neck and drags him towards the exit. Alan punches back when another bouncer runs in and forces him towards the exit, shouting how this is his third time this week. While the song reaches its crescendo, Alan is forced through a back door and into a narrow, empty back alley. One of the bouncers yells to not come back, and Alan tries to get up, but collapses onto the stone ground and swears loudly at the now closed door. He slowly gets up and almost loses his footing, until the door swings open and one of his friends, Tony, appears and frowns with worried eyes. Alan joyfully greets Tony, who thanks a bouncer for letting him out this exit, but as he approaches Alan, the door slams shut again. Alan slurs that he is fine, and a cat squeals in the distance, although after twisting round to this sound, he falls against the nearby brick wall. Tony grabs his arm and insists how he needs to go home. Alan scoffs, but allows Tony to support him down the alley, towards the street. He declares that he is not that drunk, yet Tony does not reply, and focuses on helping Alan walk. When they reach the street, Alan sporadically feels Tony's face, and slurs how he really loves him. Tony sighs, and impatiently replies that he already had a chance, although Alan becomes distracted as they pass the window of an electronics shop. Alan pulls Tony by the arm to this window and grumbles that they should be selling Game Boys by now. With a bewildered expression, Tony asks why they would be selling Gay Boys. Alan snarls back Game Boys, and Tony frowns. Alan then leans onto his tiptoes for a better view inside the shop, and informs how they are small Nintendos you can carry in your back pocket. Tony asks why he would not just use the one in his flat. Alan turns to Tony with an unsteady grin before losing his balance and smacking his head against the window. He swears in pain and Tony pulls him away from the shop, insisting that they keep moving. At first he resists, although he soon begins to yell the chorus of Never Can Say Goodbye, albeit tunelessly, and allows Tony to lead him down the street. For the next few minutes, Alan continues singing, which gains some strange reactions from passers-by. However, as this noise becomes louder and even more off-key, an old man opens his window from the other side of the street and shouts out, addressing them as stupid choirs, and telling them to shut up. This man slams his window shut, then Alan laughs and shouts abuse. Tony huffs out and warns that he will wake up the whole of Brighton if he does not stop, but the singing recommences. After a few more renditions of the song, they finally reach the front door of Alan's block of flats, where Tony spends a while trying to calm Alan down. Once he is quiet, Tony carefully leads the way into the cold hallway, then towards the winding staircase. As Alan is supported up the stairs, he hazily recounts the reason he was made to leave the nightclub earlier, but Tony seems more intent on helping him up the stairs than listening to this story. When they reach the front door, Tony asks Alan for his key, but he has trouble removing it from his front pocket. After a minute of this drunken struggle, Tony reaches into Alan's pocket and pulls out his key. Alan jokingly purrs and feels Tony's chest, although Tony moves Alan's hand, opens the front door, and asks if he has work in the morning. Alan demands to know what day it is, and Tony replies that it is now Saturday. As Alan is supported to his bedroom, he swears, then chuckles how he does have work. Tony tells him to quieten down, but he loudly whispers that he does not start until 8 o'clock. Tony points to the alarm clock at the end of the bed, which now reads 2:22. He breathes out in exasperation, and says this will only give Alan 5 hours sleep. Alan laughs, allowing himself to fall onto his bed, and he drunkenly mumbles that everything will be fine. Tony shakes his head and warns that everything will not be fine if he carries on like this. Alan dazedly tries to turn around in bed, as Tony explains how he used to be fun to be around, but he and their other friends have to constantly take care of him now. Alan carelessly pulls the covers over himself, and does not appear to be listening until Tony barks that he cares about Alan and is trying to help, but he will drink himself to death if he continues this way. Alan suddenly rips off the covers and shouts at Tony to get out. He is clearly surprised by this reaction, but Alan throws an ashtray from the bedside table, which narrowly misses his head. Tony shouts at Alan to sort himself out and storms out of the bedroom. A few seconds later, the front door slams shut, and Alan bursts into tears. He tries to catch his breath as the tears stream down his face, and for the next half hour he cries into his pillow until he finally falls asleep. The next morning, Alan suddenly awakens in his bed and squints at the light from his lamp accompanying the sun shining through the window. He looks down and frowns upon seeing that he is lying in a pool of sweat, even though he appears cold. Alan gasps and glances to the alarm clock at the end of his bed, which shows the time as 8:35. He swears repeatedly, throws off his covers, and jumps out of bed. Almost half an hour later, Alan jogs through a shopping centre and into a large showroom, full of chairs, sofas and beds. He walks briskly, weaving between the furniture and the customers, until he reaches the employee lounge at the back of the showroom. As Alan enters this small, drab room, he breathes out in relief and shuffles to a counter that contains various name tags. He shoves his tag onto his shirt, then faces a mirror and tidies his hair into place, before turning around to face the door, at which point he swears in shock. Alan's boss is stood in the doorway and snarls how this is the 3rd time this week he has arrived late. Alan quickly apologizes, whilst trying to edge his way through the doorway past his boss. He manages to step past, but the boss juts his head forwards, sniffs, and asks if he has been drinking. Alan answers that he has not, and slowly steps back, away from the doorway, although the boss tells him to stop. He approaches, and says he could smell something, then leans in and whispers, "You shirtlifters are free to do whatever you like in your own time, but not on mine." Alan looks indignantly to his boss, and swiftly turns. He passes the nearest bed, and heads further into the showroom. The boss watches him and mutters a homophobic slur under his breath. For the next few minutes, Alan slowly circulates the showroom, and watches customers examining the furniture. However, when he passes beneath a bright ceiling light, he winces and holds his hand over his eyes. Alan stops and seems to be in pain, until an old lady taps him on the shoulder. He darts round to see her stood with an old man. He continues to blink, but asks how he can help. The lady responds that she and her husband have some questions about one of the beds. Alan reluctantly allows the elderly couple to lead him to a large bed nearby. He hesitantly answers questions about the bed's price and size, but when more complex questions are asked about the bed's materials and origins, he becomes slightly flustered and breathes deeply. Neither of the couple seem to notice, and the lady professes her admiration for the leather headboard. She lights up a cigarette and looks more closely at the printed label on the back of the headboard, yet has trouble reading the print, and asks Alan if he could read this label for her. He holds his breath and crouches through the plume of smoke to read the label. The lady frowns as he starts to read, but after inhaling the strong smell of leather, he gasps and bolts upright. With an indignant tone, the lady asks what is wrong. A second later, Alan vomits over the headboard and onto the bed itself. The old man is almost hit, but he shuffles back and voices his disgust. Many other customers look over in confusion, shock, and repulsion, although a middle-aged man with slick blonde hair and a lilac suit watches from behind a nearby sofa with a curious grin. As Alan gasps for breath, The boss storms over from the other side of the showroom and demands to know what the hell is going on. The old man leads his bothered wife away, and Alan grips onto the headboard, gasping out that he is sorry. However, the boss does not listen and grabs him by the scruff of his neck. Alan tries to remove this hand, but the boss is already marching him to the showroom's entrance, growling under his breath how he is a bloody disgrace. They near the entrance and Alan repeatedly apologises, begging for forgiveness, yet the boss practically pushes him out of the showroom and shouts that he is fired. As the boss walks away, Alan pleads for another chance and declares his urgent need for this job, but 2 security guards promptly come over and stop him from re-entering the showroom. He shouts several swear words, which appears to confuse and worry other shoppers, until he eventually turns and stumbles away. Alan walks aimlessly through the shopping centre, and after a few minutes he comes to a stop against a wall. Ignoring the strange looks from various shoppers, he begins to cry, and his breathing deepens, until he hears someone from behind joke how they won't be able to sell that bed anytime soon. After flinching in shock, Alan turns to see the man in the lilac suit from the showroom, who asks if he needs money. After flinching in shock, Alan turns to see the man in the lilac suit from the showroom, who asks if he needs money. Alan cynically snaps how he is not a rent boy and walks on, but the man calls out that he could help. Alan looks back and asks if the man did not just see him get fired, solemnly adding how only an idiot would hire him. The man responds that although he did see this, he is not looking to hire anyone. He then nods to Alan and says how he would be an ideal candidate for a new opportunity. Alan squints, and the man claims he could change his life without even removing his shirt, smiling as he says the last part of this sentence. However, he then confirms this is indeed Alan's choice, and being a rent boy may be more fun. He begins to walk away until Alan breathes out in exasperation and tells him to wait. The man stops with a grin, and Alan asks what this opportunity is exactly. He replies that he can explain in more detail over a drink. Alan grimaces, and the man assures how it does not have to be alcoholic. Alan musters a smile, and the man says he knows of a place nearby which serves the perfect tea for a hangover. Alan responds how this sounds alright, and the man introduces himself as Ray Gamerton. He offers his hand, which Alan hesitantly shakes before introducing himself in return. A few minutes later, after meandering through an area of the city known as the Lanes, Ray and Alan sit down at a table in a small tea room, furnished with wooden floors, stools, and tables. As an elderly woman with white curls comes through a door at the back of the room, Alan looks round and comments that he has never noticed this place before. Ray gladly responds how it is a hidden treasure and summons the woman over. When she reaches the table, Ray orders 2 of the usual. Alan appears curious, but before he can speak, Ray asks him to explain what happened at the showroom. He begins by recounting the previous night, including being ejected from the nightclub and the argument with his friend, Tony. Whilst Alan is explaining how he felt upon coming into work, the drinks arrive. Ray thanks the elderly waitress, and after taking a sip of his drink, poses a few more questions. Over the next 5 minutes, Alan reveals that he has been single for a few months, has only spoken to his parents a handful of times since he came out 2 years ago, and has never held a job for longer than 4 months. He also informs Ray that he enjoys Kylie Minogue and Max Headroom, but dislikes pinstripe suits and Prince Charles after what he did to Diana. By this point, Ray has almost finished his drink, and Alan finally takes a large gulp of his own. He grimaces in revulsion and sneers that this tea tastes like vodka. Ray grins and replies how it is not tea, but soju, an alcoholic drink originating in Korea. Alan's face twists in disgust, and he gasps that Ray said he was ordering tea. Ray casually replies how he mentioned this place sold the perfect tea for a hangover, but he never said this was what he was ordering. Alan looks annoyed, and Ray states, "The devil's in the detail," before winking with a grin. Alan anxiously calls to the waitress for some water. As she begins to fill a glass, Ray says that he believes Alan would be an eligible candidate for what is essentially the opportunity of a lifetime. He reaches into the pocket of his jacket, but when he pulls out a business card, Alan gulps and runs to the door at the back of the room. Whilst Alan is heard vomiting in the toilet behind this door, Ray downs the rest of his drink and approaches the counter. He quietly chuckles to the waitress that he wouldn't bet on this one, and she nods in amused agreement. Ray leans over and kisses the waitress on the cheek, addressing her as Mum, and saying he needs to head off now. Ray's mother nods and mouths that she loves him, then he heads out into the street. A few minutes later, Alan comes out from the toilet to see that Ray is no longer there. He asks the waitress where Ray has gone, and she silently points to the entrance before handing him the glass of water. Without thanking her, Alan glugs some water and slams down the glass. He grabs his jacket, but as he walks towards the exit, the waitress alerts him to the card which Ray left on the table. He walks back to see this card, featuring a circle, triangle, and square in a horizontal line. Beneath these shapes is Ray's name and a phone number, along with the words "play or be played," printed in block capitals at the bottom of the card. Alan curiously mutters these words, then takes the card and leaves the tea room with a puzzled expression. After walking along the lane in a daze for the next minute, Alan notices a man and a pregnant woman intimately holding hands at a table outside a cafe on his left. He seems perturbed and keeps walking, then looks to the right and sees a man of his age buying a red leather coat in a small boutique. Alan stops and exhales with a frown. He pulls the card from his pocket and examines it in disbelief, then shrugs and peers down the lane to see a rusty telephone box. Upon entering this box, Alan dials the number on the card. Almost immediately, a low male voice greets him and asks if he would like to partake in the opportunity of a lifetime. Alan pauses, but responds that he would, and the voice asks who referred him. He scrambles for the name on the card and eventually gives it as Ray Gamerton. A beep sounds on the line, and a collected female voice asks for the caller's name. He replies that it's Alan Thompson. Then the voice asks for his date of birth, which he gives as the 9th of June 1966. A pause ensues, and Alan frowns, looking at the cold blue sea beyond the end of the street. After almost a minute, the voice suddenly thanks him for waiting, which makes him jump and drop the phone. Alan yanks it back up with the cord, just in time to hear that a car will be waiting for him at the entrance to the West Pier at 9 o'clock this evening. He raises his eyebrows and asks how he will know which car it is. Before the voice can reply, he also asks how she knows he's in Brighton. A few seconds pass, then he is told they will identify him. Alan looks unsure of what to say, but the voice tells him not to be late and wishes him luck. The call ends, and Alan stares at the phone in his hand. He gradually musters a smile until an old man bangs on the telephone box and shouts that he needs to call his wife. Alan regains focus and hangs up the phone before leaving the box and strolling on towards the sea. A few hours later, a slender young woman named Diane is lying on a large satin-covered bed that sits against the wall of an extravagantly furnished bedroom. She looks in detail at various outfits in a copy of Vogue magazine and tears the corners of certain pages with one hand, whilst twiddling her crimped blonde hair with the other. On an exquisite chest of drawers in the corner is a television, which is airing Catchphrase, although she does not seem to be paying it much attention. There is a knock on the door, and without taking her eyes off the magazine, Diane says to come in. An elderly maid enters the room and cheerfully says, "Good afternoon." Diane unenthusiastically and somewhat sarcastically responds, "Hi, Kwan," without looking up. As Diane tears the corner of page 41, Kwan frowns and picks up a dress from the floor. She takes it to the laundry bin in the corner of the room and looks through the window, commenting that it is nice weather for a November afternoon. Diane looks up to the television to see a column of the word chance written in different colours with an arrow pointing to the bottom of this column. Kwan watches and joyfully shouts, "Last chance!" which makes Diane jump and rip off too much of page 45's corner. This is revealed to be the correct answer, and Kwan lightly claps her hands. Diane rolls her eyes and uses the remote control to change the channel to Home and Away. Kwan appears disappointed, but hangs up several clean dresses in the wardrobe, and with a thoughtful tone, asks Diane why she does not work. She does not initially respond, and Kwan states that when she was her age, she had no option but to work for little money each day. Continuing to focus on the television, Diane replies how although it is none of Kwan's business, she is waiting for a suitable job. She also justifies how it is not her fault Maggie messed up the job market. Kwan walks towards the bedside table, which is full of half-empty glasses. She states that Diane's father would not be able to pay for this wonderful house if he did not work for Mrs. Thatcher. Diane sighs and replies how this does not mean she is a political prisoner, and they are in Devon, not North Korea. Gripping onto a glass of sticky orange liquid, Kwan exhales and grits her teeth. She puts the glass down and firmly states that she has told Diane many times she is from South Korea, not North Korea. Diane says nothing, but stares at the screen, which shows a group of young people lying on a sunny beach. Hwang continues to glare from behind, and Diane asks why the weather is always so nice on TV. Before Hwang can respond, Diane yawns, then announces she is bored and wants to go into town. She gets up very slowly, and after entering her ensuite bathroom, yells at Hwang through the door to make her bed. Hwang narrows her eyes to the closing bathroom door, and as the shower water begins to run, she glares down and shakes her head at the Vogue magazine. Half an hour later, Hwang is polishing silverware in the kitchen when a car's horn beeps outside the front of the house. She seems perplexed and cautiously approaches, then opens the front door. A taxi is parked on the long gravel driveway. The driver shouts that he received a call for a taxi into town, but Hwang shouts over the grinding of the engine how this must be a mistake. The driver reads this address from his notepad when Hwang is distracted by loud footsteps on the stairs. She turns to see Diane coming down in a thin jumper and trousers of an identical cream colour, along with a lemon-yellow blazer and Donna Karan handbag. Diane stops by a mirror in the hallway and orders Hwang to tell the driver that she will be out in a second. As she applies a bright red lipstick in the mirror, Hwang re-enters the house and asks in a bewildered tone why she needs a taxi into town when it is less than a mile away. Diane ignores this question and finishes applying her lipstick, while Hwang begins to recall that when she was her age, she had to walk everywhere. Mimicking Hwang's accent, Diane impatiently interrupts, 6 miles to school each day when I was a young girl in North Korea. Diane says Hwang is a broken record, then shoves past and slams the front door behind her. Hwang seethes with closed eyes, and her arms shake as she exhales. When the taxi is heard driving away, Hwang's eyes spring open. She storms through the hallway to the telephone, which she nearly yanks off the wall. Hwang jabs in a number, and after a few rings, tells the person on the other end that they were correct. Without pausing for breath, she instructs them to come over now, as she does not know how much time they have. Shortly after sunset, a taxi pulls into the driveway, and Diane gets out with several bags of clothes and a few other purchases. She enters the house and walks past the front lounge, in which her mother is already falling asleep on a large sofa, with an almost empty bottle of wine on the adjacent table. Diane heads through the house, dumps her bags on the kitchen table, and walks through the garden, to a building which houses the family's swimming pool. She changes into a beige swimsuit and dives into the pool. She proceeds to swim continuous lengths, taking just a small break approximately once every 10 minutes. After almost an hour, she stops this exercise and glides out into the centre of the pool, then lies back in the water to face the ceiling. For several minutes, Diane floats serenely with closed eyes. She suddenly screams and lets her head fall back, so that the scream can only just be heard above the surface of the water. A little over a minute later, Diane quietly resurfaces and lasts for nearly 10 seconds. She appears more relaxed and gets out of the pool, then changes back into her clothes and returns through the garden to the house. Diane enters the kitchen and looks around, as if expecting for something to be different, but after realizing that nothing has changed, she heads to the fridge and puts a ready meal into the microwave. Whilst the meal is cooking, she goes up to her bedroom, from which she grabs a cigarette and the Vogue magazine. When she comes downstairs, she takes the ready meal from the microwave and sits down to eat at the kitchen table. Diane turns on the television to see footage of a famine in Ethiopia, which features several graphic images of starving and emaciated children. She tucks and changes the channel, then tucks into the ready meal and opens the magazine. After finishing her supper, Diane checks her watch and changes the channel again to hear that EastEnders is about to begin. As the opening theme tune plays, she lights a cigarette and breezes through the magazine, until she notices a large advertisement taking up most of the page. This advert calls for models to apply for a new fashion house, which is due to open in Exeter at the start of 1990. Diane excitedly rereads the text, then gasps with delight and shouts out for her mother, but to no response. She looks at the advert once more and notices a circle, triangle, and square in a horizontal line, along with a phone number and the deadline for the application, which is November the 18th. After glancing at a calendar on the wall and seeing this is today's date, she grabs the phone from the hallway and frantically dials the number. After a few rings, a vivacious female voice wishes Diane a good evening and asks if she is calling in regards to the opportunity in Vogue magazine. Diane hastily replies that she is, and asks if it is too late to apply, but the voice politely states how they need to take some details from her first. Diane is asked for her name, which she gives as Diane Harris Carter. She quickly assures that this is not the name she will be using professionally, although the voice encouragingly states that there is a touch of dynasty to this name. Diane grimaces at the phone until she is asked for her date of birth, which she gives as the 25th of December 1967. The voice jokes that Christmas must be a busy time for her, and Diane rolls her eyes, but laughs politely. Taking a sudden change in tone, the voice informs, however, that they normally ask for pictures of potential candidates to be sent to them before they accept an application, and due to how close Diane is applying to the deadline, they may have to delay her application until the next season. Yet Diane shouts to wait, and passionately argues how she will do anything for this opportunity, including coming to Exeter that night, adding that it is less than an hour from where she lives. The woman on the phone seems hesitant, although after spending the next minute rescheduling some appointments later this evening, she confirms that a car can be sent for Diane at 9 o'clock. Diane gasps with joy, but tries to mask this sound from being heard on the phone. She is asked for her address, which she gives without hesitation. After confirming these details, the voice wishes her luck and confirms that they look forward to meeting her later. The call ends, and Diane yelps as she excitedly runs up the stairs to her bedroom. Two hours later, on a street of bars in Soho, a number of young women and a few young men are leaning into the windows of a long gridlocked line of cars and speaking to the drivers. On the pavement, many other young people chat, smoke, and keep warm together as they watch this business. A young woman with short dark curls and a pale face, named Joanne, walks along the pavement in a tight yellow top and vibrant red jacket, accompanied by her friend, Melissa. They walk past an adult shop, and Melissa briefly watches a live show in the window, but Joanne focuses on the drivers of the cars as they negotiate with potential clients. Turning away from the window, Melissa asks if Saturday nights are always this busy. Joanne sniggers and responds that most men are expected to be cooped up at home during these long winter evenings, but when they are bored enough by their wives, they brave this weather for anything else. An older man suddenly calls from a window above that he will give Joanne a few quid for a certain intimate act. She smiles and shouts back how she will agree to this if he wears a bag on his head, which triggers a laugh from other men at the window. The older man shouts abuse and throws a glass bottle down towards Joanne, but she and Melissa jump to the side and narrowly avoid being hit. Melissa squeaks, but Joanne scoffs and shouts up that he should come down and fight like a man. Joanne continues exchanging threats with this man, but Melissa's eye is caught by a reasonably attractive man who is beckoning her from a nearby car. Melissa approaches this car, and after a while Joanne looks towards her. She peers round to see the driver, then smiles and asks, "Mr. Burton?" The driver rapidly blushes when he spots Joanne, and she joins Melissa at his window. He reaches over to wind it up, but before he can do this, Joanne opens the door and sits down in the passenger seat, joyfully declaring that it is indeed him, while Melissa watches in amused surprise. Joanne grins and asks Mr. Burton what he is doing here, to which he responds in a fluster how he is trying to find a place to park, and she needs to get out of his car. The car in front then moves, but Joanne opens the passenger door, and it almost hits a lamppost on the pavement. Mr. Burton slams his foot on the brakes, and a gap soon opens on the road in front, which triggers hooting from the car behind. Mr. Burton impatiently states that he is in a hurry, as his brother's surprise birthday party is due to start soon. Joanne gives a wry smile, and replies how this can't be true, as his brother's birthday is February the 18th, the same as Mary the 1st's, which she told them in class was how he remembered her date of birth. Mr. Burton realises his mistake, and more cars begin to hoot from behind. Joanne gestures to Melissa to enter the car. As she sits down on the back seat, Joanne closes the front door, and Mr. Burton drives on, which finally stops the racket behind them. Without looking at Joanne, he nervously begs her not to say anything about him visiting this district. However, Joanne shoots him a mischievous grin, then turns around to Melissa and inquires if she is interested in offering her services to Mr. Burton. Melissa nods contently and claims her normal rate is £20. Following a thoughtful pause, Joanne suggests they call it £50, and for Mr. Burton to give Joanne herself £20, so she can forget she ever saw him here. He seems unsure, but she gives him a knowing look, and reasons how she could ask for more. Mr. Burton huffs and takes a £20 note from his wallet, which he begrudgingly hands to Joanne, before ordering her to get out of his car. She grins and says that it is a pleasure to see him again, and tells Melissa to meet at the usual spot later. Joanne gets out of the car and tells Mr. Burton that he was wrong, as she was indeed paying attention in class. He snarls, but she addresses him as Sir and wishes him a pleasant evening before slamming the car door and walking off. She pockets the money and continues down the street until she reaches a neon sign reading International Striptease. She stands still and observes this sign, which causes two other young women standing beneath it to watch her suspiciously. Joanne spends the next minute carefully reading out each letter of the word international. She then says the whole word out loud and asks the women if this is what the sign says. The thinner of these women frowns, but slowly nods. Joanne smiles excitedly and asks which country they think has the best strippers. The women give each other another strange look as Joanne turns back to the sign and answers, "Probably not us," before elaborating how there could be a competition for this, like the Olympics. The thinner woman asks Joanne what she has taken. She struggles to contain a giggle, which eventually comes out. The larger woman screws up her face and tells Joanne to get lost, but she is already crossing the street. She walks down a few more streets, then enters a dark and almost empty bar, in which slow jazz music is playing. She approaches the barman, exchanges pleasantries, and asks for a cosmopolitan. He looks surprised, and says that Joanne must be having a good night, to which she grins and nods. As the barman begins to make the drink, Joanne heads to a table by the window and watches the other young people on this street trying to make some money. The barman brings the cosmopolitan to the table and says that it costs £2.10. Joanne jokingly replies, "£1.10, Rich?" But he grins and responds that for her, it will be just £2. She thanks him and takes out some coins from her pocket. She spends about 10 seconds examining the coins, but after wincing her eyes nearly shut, she huffs out and hands Rich the £20 note. He seems surprised, but takes the note over to the bar and comes back with Joanne's change. He tells her to enjoy her drink, and she smiles in appreciation, adding that she hopes his brother gets out of hospital soon. He thanks her and walks back to the bar. While sipping her drink, Joanne looks towards the clouds in the dark sky beyond the street and becomes almost hypnotized by the heights and lights of the surrounding buildings. A minute later, a young man with razor-cut black hair, wearing a thin grey suit and a buttoned-up white shirt, walks into the bar. He approaches Joanne from behind and states that she seems to have a way with words. She slowly turns, and with a perplexed expression, asks what he means. The man responds that he was impressed by how she dealt with that geezer in the car. Joanne demands to know what the man wants with her, and he asks how much she charges for the night, although she eyes him suspiciously, without saying a word. After a few seconds of silence, the man says he is not a policeman, yet Joanne replies that she is not worried if he is, as she has done nothing wrong. The man grins, and Joanne asks how a way with words affects her ability to show a good time. He responds that carnal lust is skin deep, whilst emotional lust is much more gripping. Joanne focuses on the man as he says this, until a grin forms on her face, and she asks what price he considers to be reasonable. He is about to answer, when Joanne claims she was about to call it a night. After a brief pause, the man replies that he will pay her £300. Joanne eyes him very suspiciously, and asks how he can afford to pay her this amount of money when he is dressed like an AHA reject. He seems surprised, but points to Joanne's bright yellow top and chuckles that he would rather look like this than a Sesame Street extra. She looks down and opens her mouth in amusement, then replies how it helps to stand out. The man nods and humorously concedes, "Good point." Joanne asks his name, and he replies that it is David Theaterhan. She sips from her glass and says she thought she saw him in the magazines. David says nothing, and Joanne continues to eye him until she finishes her drink and places it on the table. She then looks into the street and, after a quiet pause, asks what he is waiting for. David seems confused until Joanne asks if he has a place. He replies that his hotel is around the corner, and Joanne nods, telling him to lead the way. As David grins and walks with Joanne to the door, she looks back to Rich and points to the camera by the entrance. Rich inconspicuously nods back, and Joanne leaves the bar with David. Within 10 minutes, they enter the main room of David's decorated hotel suite, complete with a chandelier, shining ornaments, and crisp materials. Joanne looks around in marvel as David offers to take her jacket, which she silently allows to be pulled off her back. David marches to a bar near the window, pours himself a whiskey, and asks if Joanne wants a drink. She appears captivated by a portrait of a well-built white stallion on the wall, but quietly responds that she might have one later. Joanne then walks to the window and stares out at London's skyline, with Big Ben and the River Thames in the distance. She puts her hands against the glass and breathes out deeply as she takes in this view. Sipping on his whiskey, David approaches Joanne from behind, then puts his hand onto hers. He declares that in the month he has been living here, he has not grown at all tired of this view. Joanne refocuses and turns round, releasing her hand from David's. Looking him straight in the eye, she declares that if he has lived here for a month, he can definitely afford to give her the £300 up front. David smiles and reaches into his pocket. While he rifles through the notes in his wallet, Joanne curiously says how he can afford this suite for a month and is younger and much better looking than most of her other clients. Although David begins to speak, Diane interrupts that he could easily find a girl for free. He grins and unbuttons his shirt. Then she asks what sort of work he does to earn this amount of money. He hands her £300 in notes and replies, investment. Joanne carefully observes the notes, but frowns and demands to know what he is investing in to make this sort of money. David finishes his whiskey and answers that he invests in recruitment opportunities, as it is something the country still needs. Without another word, he gestures to the adjacent bedroom and asks Diane to wait in there. Giving David a knowing smile, Diane silently walks over and enters this room, where she is once again in awe, this time towards the finely decorated bed, the iridescent curtains, and the luminous sculptures. Within 2 minutes, Joanne is lying naked upon the bed, with her pale thighs positioned close enough to retain a sense of decorum, but not too close to appear off-limits. She smiles as David walks in, yet without looking at her, he starts to undress. She compliments him on this suite, and he asks if she would rather have access to his money or his body. Joanne raises her eyebrows and coolly answers, both. Now stood only in his briefs, David laughs and turns round, looking into Joanne's eyes. She feels her toes stretch out a little, and her fingers quiver gently, until David smiles and takes off his underwear. For the next half hour, the pair become intimate in a variety of positions, and appear to experience genuine pleasure from each other's bodies and minds. When the intercourse passes its climax, Joanne gasps in pleasure, and finds herself leaning down to kiss David, which he hesitantly reciprocates. A quiet moment passes, and Joanne apologizes to David for kissing him just then. However, he responds that it is not a problem. He reaches over to grab a pack of cigarettes from his bedside table, one of which he puts in his own mouth, and another of which he offers to Joanne, but she politely declines. David takes a puff, and Joanne asks if he wants her again the following night. He gives no response, yet simply looks at her and inhales. Joanne slowly looks away, then gets up, puts on a bra and knickers, and walks towards the tall windows overlooking the street. She opens the curtains and looks down at the street, where other young women are trying to offer their services. David sighs and declares how she is not right for this job. Joanne whips round with a snarl, almost shouting that he is the first to complain. David laughs and replies that this is not what he means. Joanne eyes him in confusion as he gets out of bed and joins her at the window. He looks along the street, then gestures to the line of cars below and tells Joanne she is wasting herself here, but she responds with a discreet roll of her eyes that she cannot find another job. David asks what she means. Joanne recounts how she left school as soon as she could because she could not handle the other students and did not want to feel like a burden to the teachers. David comments that Joanne does not seem like the type to be affected by what others think, but she explains how she therefore left school 3 years ago without any A-levels or even O-levels and just ended up here. Joanne ends this sentence with a touch of sorrow. David runs his hands through her dark curls and says she has a feisty mind, which is worth more than any qualification he can think of. Joanne's glum expression turns to a meagre smile as she turns round to face him. David exhales the last of his cigarette and flicks it from the window. He appears to be in deep thought and looks past Joanne into the street below. She asks what he is thinking, and following a few more seconds of silence, he replies that he knows of an upcoming opportunity. Joanne's attention is clearly taken, and David claims it's the first of its kind in this country. Joanne asks to know more, and David grins, but explains how he is sworn to secrecy. Still looking intrigued, although somewhat skeptical, Joanne frowns and says this sounds dodgy, before gesturing to the street and asking why he does not want to offer this opportunity to any of the other girls. David replies that he thinks she has only shown him the tip of the iceberg so far, and is the only one he has seen to be worthy of investment. Joanne watches the back of David's naked body as he walks over to the bedside table, from which he takes a card featuring a circle, triangle, and square in a horizontal line, along with a number below. David hands it to Joanne, and he watches her gaze over the shapes and words. Yet after a while, she looks up and demands to know what this is really about. David looks into Joanne's eyes, and she asks if he wants to invest in her or not. Half an hour later, Alan is waiting at the entrance to Brighton's West Pier, carrying little more than a backpack with some spare clothes. Although the temperature is typical of a cold November evening, he is dressed in a light denim jacket and trousers, which causes his teeth to chatter at sporadic intervals. As a group of loud, drunken women walk onto the pier behind Alan, he checks his watch and sees that the time is 8:58. He looks anxiously at the cars driving past, but eyes certain people suspiciously whenever they walk onto or off the pier behind him, which causes some of them to look back at him in a similar manner. After another minute, tears begin to form in Alan's eyes, either due to sadness or the cold. Yet just when his teeth start chattering again, a large dark blue car indicates and slows down as it pulls in. Alan is clearly relieved when it stops in front of him, but his expression almost immediately turns to bewilderment when he notices the car's blacked out windows. Alan turns his head and grimaces. The front passenger window opens for him to see the driver, wearing a dark blue jumpsuit, along with a dark opaque mask featuring a large white circle. Alan's eyes widen in surprise, and he begins to step back, when the driver speaks in a distorted and amplified voice, asking for his surname. Alan stares through the window and gulps, but just as the driver looks ready to repeat this question, he gingerly replies, Thompson. The driver then asks if his date of birth is the 9th of July, 1967. Alan turns and looks back to a couple holding hands as they walk off the pier. They do not notice him and walk off in another direction. A gust of cold wind flies in from the sea. Alan shivers and turns back to the driver, responding that this is correct. The driver reaches for the handbrake, but after a brief silence, Alan quickly corrects himself, informing how his birthday is actually the 9th of June. A longer silence occurs, as Alan looks straight towards the driver's mask and fidgets with his hands beneath the view of the window. The driver then presses a button on the dashboard and tells Alan to get in. The middle of the car's doors opens, and Alan breathes out in relief. However, upon approaching the door, he sees a short woman with shaved blonde hair lying still on the back seat. Alan squints and asks what happened. The driver remains facing ahead and gives no answer. Alan frowns and looks back to the entrance of the pier, where a pair of drunken men are arguing loudly. He sniffs and gets into the car, then closes the door and sits in front of the sleeping woman. The car moves off, quickly picking up speed. Alan looks out at the moonlit sea and asks the driver where they are going, although he once again receives no response. He hides his impatience and asks how long this journey will take. The driver continues to ignore him and presses a button on the dashboard. A hissing instantly sounds from the car's roof, and Alan looks up in horror. He frantically asks what this is, but before he can react any further, he becomes docile. Within seconds, he slumps over to his side, in a similar position to the other passenger. After driving for 2 minutes, the driver pulls over and prods Alan's nose with a long metal stick, although he remains still. The driver takes out a map of Brighton, marked with 3 X signs. He runs his finger along the map to one of the other X signs, then pulls back out into the road. A minute later in Devon, Diane is struggling to lift a large suitcase out of the dumbwaiter next to the kitchen. Once it is finally on the ground, she very carefully wheels it through to the hallway. She peers into the lounge to see her mother, who is holding a glass of red wine in one hand and the telephone in the other. She listens as her mother complains into the phone about the ongoing ambulance strikes, which have made it harder for her to see a GP for her insomnia. Diane waits in the doorway and soon appears to grow impatient, but just as her mother finally notices her, a set of car headlights begin to illuminate the room from outside. With a casual tone, Diane says she is going away for the night, and her mother mutters, "Hold on," into the phone. She asks where Diane is going, to which she excitedly responds that she has a modelling audition this evening. Diane begins to give more details when her mother interrupts and tells her to have fun, but not spend too much. Her mother turns back to the phone and takes a sip of wine. Diane turns and wheels her suitcase to the front door. She opens the door to see a large dark blue car. She turns back into the house and looks as if she is about to say something, yet stops herself and yanks the suitcase through the doorway. The passenger side window is open, and the masked driver looks through to see Diane approaching. She does not seem to notice him, and leaves her suitcase next to the car. She then opens the back door and practically jumps onto the back row of seats. Diane frowns as she examines the car's interior, but her attention is caught by the dark blue jumpsuit, which covers the back of the driver's head. He remains silent, until Diane asks if there is a problem. Without turning round, the driver asks in a distorted voice for her name and date of birth. She rolls her eyes and gives this information. He then asks if Diane wants her bag, and it seems to take her a few seconds to realise that he means her suitcase. She replies in a cynical tone that yes, she would, as it was specially made in Milan and contains dresses that are worth more than this car. Diane begins to list some of the labels featured in this suitcase, but the driver tells her to put it in the boot. She screws up her eyes and grunts, then lets out an overly loud sigh as she gets out of the car. She grabs her suitcase and wheels it round to the boot. After heaving for a minute, she eventually manages to lift it inside. With another loud sigh, she gets back into the car and announces she is ready. The journey begins, and the car travels along a dark country road. Diane stoically looks out the window at the thick forests before the rolling fields beyond. After a few minutes, she returns her gaze to the back of the driver's head and asks if they are heading to the A30, but he says nothing in return. Diane rolls her eyes and shouts that she would like to know what time her audition is. She once again receives no response, and breathes out impatiently, before unbuckling her seatbelt and leaning over into the middle row of seats. From this position, Diane manages to see the driver's mask, and she blinks in shock. In a panicked tone, she asks why he is wearing a mask. He slams a foot down on the accelerator, and Diane is thrown back into her seat. Gasping in pain and catching her breath, she darts her eyes round and shouts to let her out. She pulls down on the nearest door handle, albeit to no effect. Her breathing quickens as she tries to wind down the window, although they do not open either. Whilst the car's speed increases, Diane shouts at the driver to let her out. She jumps up in her seat and leans over the row in front, then lashes a hand out at the driver and scratches his mask. Yet it remains firmly in place, and he jolts round to punch Diane. The car swerves into a bushy tree, and she falls across the back row of seats. She yelps in pain and grips her nose as the driver recovers the car's steering. Tears fall down Diane's face, and she calls for her father. The driver swears and presses a button on the dashboard, which triggers a hissing from above. Diane falls silent and shudders as she looks to the car's ceiling. She yanks up her blouse and covers it over her mouth, then turns herself sideways and with great force kicks a stiletto against the window. The driver twists round to this sound but keeps driving ahead. Although Diane appears to be losing consciousness, she does not relent in kicking against the window, which causes some small cracks against the glass. However, these sounds gradually cease, and after a minute, the driver looks round to see Diane lying still. He lets out a sigh of relief as the car persists along the empty, darkened road. A peaceful few minutes go by, then the driver adjusts the car's radio frequency. He picks up a connected speaker and shouts how the player has not even been in the car for 5 minutes, but he has already muted her. A faint crackling is heard from the radio, followed by the voice of Kwan, responding that he knows now what she has to endure every day. The driver laughs and states how she will be lucky to make it to the first game without someone shooting her dead. At this precise moment in Soho, David Thetahan is looking down from his hotel suite onto a narrow and poorly lit alley by a side door to the hotel. He struggles to stand still and fidgets his fingers, but just when he starts pining once more for something to hurry up, a dark blue car pulls into the alley and parks by a pair of large dumpsters. David instantly stops moving and pays avid attention to this car. After a few seconds, the door from the hotel opens onto the alley, and Joanne walks through. She looks around with caution and walks to the driver's window. She looks back at herself in its reflection and breathes deeply. The window opens, and her expression does not change when she sees the mask of the driver, who waits in silence for a few seconds, then asks in a distorted female voice if she is Joanna Williams. Joanne grins and answers that she is actually Joanne Williams. Without another word, the driver asks her to confirm her date of birth, and she calmly responds, 2nd of September, 1970. The driver gestures to the door for the middle row of seats and tells her to get in. Joanne approaches and touches its handle, but before pulling open the door, she looks up to the highest floor of the hotel. She sees David watching from his window. He looks down and nods in reassurance. She breathes deeply, then shoots him a calm smile and opens the car's door. Joanne looks into the car and sees an emaciated young man snoring lightly across the back row of seats. She briefly examines him, then sits upon the seat in front and straps herself in. She turns to the driver and looks ready to ask something when the engine starts and the car pulls forward through the alley. The car is on the motorway within minutes, and Joanne remains focused on the driver's left hand, which is gripping the gear stick. Joanne waits a little before asking how the driver is this evening, and she casually replies with the word fine. Joanne lets out a tentative smile, although it disappears after a few seconds, when the driver's hand removes a small plastic cap from a red button on the dashboard. Joanne slams her eyes shut and a moment later a hissing is heard above. Her head promptly drops forward and rolls to the side. The driver whistles to herself, and the car continues along the motorway. "200 players have been placed in an enormous, darkened, rectangular building. Despite reaching a great height, the walls to this building contain no windows, but are formed from a bland grey metal, which is almost identical to that of the floor. Along the front wall, a set of locked doors are placed in the middle of a metre-high platform, with a large electrical screen directly above. A set of locked doors is located on both sides of the back wall as well, although no platform sits at this end of the room. On both sides of the front platform are steps which lead up to raised floors. These floors run all the way along the side walls and feature speakers and cameras at regular intervals. A series of long horizontal lights also hang from the ceiling, in line with the speakers. However, these lights are currently inactive, hence the total darkness in the room below. Most of the 200 players are still asleep in single beds, which have been divided into 20 rows, each containing 10 beds. On a bed in the third row is a woman in her early 30s with a grubby face and dirty, bedraggled hair. She stirs and narrowly opens her eyes, but closes them a split second later and snuggles back into her duvet with a comfortable smile. Yet as this woman begins to hear quiet and scattered conversations throughout the room, her smile slowly fades. She opens her eyes fully and stares through the darkness to the metal ceiling, then down to the bed in which she is lying. She mutters to herself and looks left, to see an elderly woman sleeping in a dark tracksuit jacket within the next bed. The woman with dirty hair squints at the older woman's jacket until she appears to make out the numbers 027 printed in white upon the arm. After mouthing these numbers, she peers to the right and sees a short, balding man sleeping in the adjacent bed, wearing a jacket with 025 printed on the breast pocket. She then looks down at her own dark blue jacket and white t-shirt to see the numbers 026. Player 26 blinks and rests back on her elbows as she adjusts her eyesight to the relative darkness around her. She makes out a few silhouettes of other awakened players and looks ahead to see the outline of Player 3, holding his head in his hands as he rocks back and forth on his bed. Player 26 briefly watches him, but is soon distracted by Player 16, a mousy young woman with delicate glasses, who is lying on the bed directly ahead, crying and mumbling that she wants to go home. Player 17, an older woman with white curls and glasses, sits with Player 16 on her bed and rubs her back, repeatedly calling her pet and affirming with a Geordie accent that everything will be fine. Player 26 leans back in her bed, without being noticed by these women, whom she continues to watch. As her vision further adjusts to the darkness, she is able to see beyond, and observes the movements of 6 players who are examining the set of doors beneath the screen. Player 26 continues to watch this group for almost a minute, whilst they cluelessly discuss how to open these doors. The expression on Player 26's face is one of bewilderment, but not panic. She starts to hear more noise behind her, and looks around. Her eyebrows rise as she slowly makes out the sheer size of the room, along with a vast amount of beds, in which more players are waking up. She remains still in her bed, and her eyes shift between players until her focus is swayed towards a quiet, rhythmic chanting to her left. She glances past Player 27 to see the head of Player 28 appear above the side of his bed, then descend once more beneath. Player 26 watches intently for almost 10 seconds, and Player 28's head rises above the side of his bed again. She frowns as he mutters to his right shoulder, then his left, and at that moment her expression neutralizes in apparent understanding. Whilst Player 28 closes his eyes and whispers more unintelligible words, Player 26 turns back to her right and regards Player 25, the short balding man. Still deep in slumber, he continues to snore, but moves his hand against the sheet, allowing a glint of light to reflect from a diamond ring on his finger. Player 26 narrows her eyes upon this ring and moves her legs round to this side of her bed until she suddenly freezes. She keeps her entire body still except for her eyes, which follow a player when he scurries past to the front of the room. Once he has passed the next row, Player 26 relaxes her body, slithers off the side of her bed, and crawls towards Player 25, without being noticed by anyone else. When she nears the side of his bed, Player 26 watches his mouth open further, and his snoring loudens. She looks around and quietly clicks her fingers in his face, but he continues to snore. After a few seconds, Player 26 reaches towards Player 25's ring with one hand and grips his sleeve with the other. She holds her breath as she gently lifts his sleeve so that his finger points towards her face. Player 26 very carefully grips onto Player 25's ring with her other hand before moving it mere millimeters towards her. The ring starts travelling along his finger, although he continues to snore. After spending almost a minute inching the ring over the finger's first knuckle, Player 26 breathes out and looks around to see that she has still not been noticed. In fact, most awakened players are distracted by the noisy, futile efforts to prise open the doors on the front platform. There is only a minor increase in the volume of Player 25's snoring when the ring passes over his smaller knuckle, until a clamour of loud expletives is heard from the far end of the room. Player 25 stirs, and Player 26 hurries to roll beneath his bed. A little over 10 seconds later, his snoring resumes, and Player 26 creeps back out. She is about to continue moving the ring along Player 25's finger when a voice from behind asks what she's doing. Player 26 twists round to Player 28, the young man who was chanting to himself. Through the darkness, she can now just about make out his dark skin and sizable beard. Player 26 looks exasperated, but before she can respond, they both hear Player 13, a short man with a shaggy beard, whispering from his bed that this is not the interview he was promised. Whilst Player 28 becomes distracted by what Player 13 is saying, Player 26 looks across to see a silver watch on the wrist of Alan, who is sleeping serenely in his bed and wearing clothes that mark him as Player 23. Player 26 creeps out of Player 28's line of sight, then over towards Alan, Player 23. She kneels on the floor next to his bed and examines the watch on his wrist. After squinting through the dark, she makes out that its hands are not moving. Player 26 examines Alan's face through the dark until she hears Player 28 stop behind her. He is about to ask something to Player 26 when she gestures to the watch and relays that it's broken. Player 28 does not comment on this, but instead asks where they are. Player 26 turns around and shrugs unknowingly, then looks back to Alan. Player 28 eyes his surroundings, then lets out a gradual grin and practically chuckles about how they have been knocked out and put in a dark shed. Player 26 gives no reaction. Player 28 gestures to the growing number of players he can see trying to exit through the front doors beneath the inactive screen, and comments that if they did agree to be here, people are starting to get rowdy. Player 26 mutters under her breath how at least they are not outside. Player 28 frowns and asks Player 26 for her name. Whilst looking past Alan to Player 22, she answers that it's Tracy, but does not ask for Player 28's name in return. After a few seconds of looking at the back of Tracy's head, Player 28 gives his name as Yusuf. A series of loud shouts and bangs then sound from the other side of the room, which alerts many players, including Tracy, Player 26, and Yusuf, Player 28. Just as the noise begins to die down, Alan jerks awake and grabs onto Tracy's wrist. She jumps in shock and yanks her wrist free from his grip. Alan shuffles towards her in his bed and asks where he is. Yet before Tracy can reply, the screen ahead activates and displays a message reading, "Welcome to the Squid Game." With an incredulous tone, Yusuf reads this message aloud and asks how squid can play games with each other when they are just squid. He begins to ask what squid even do exactly, although Tracy ignores him and gets up from the ground. Alan shoots a panicked finger at the screen, then gulps and turns round to view the entirety of the enormous room. Even through the darkness, he can see the plethora of beds and the states of confusion, surprise, and fear on the faces of nearby players as they read the screen's message. Alan's breathing deepens and his skin turns pale. He catches Yusuf's sigh and shakily asks what the hell this place is. Yusuf regards the rest of the room for a few seconds, then lets out a sly grin. Alan squints, and Yusuf asks in an ironic tone if he has not heard. Tracy darts her eyes over, and Alan shakes his head in disbelief. Yusuf smiles, and with a joyous tone, answers how this is, of course, the opportunity of a lifetime.